The federal courthouse erupted in stunned silence as the words cut through the air like a lightning bolt. I will defend her in court. Every head in the packed gallery snapped toward the source of the voice, a tall man in maintenance coveralls, tool belt hanging from his waist, standing in the doorway with unwavering determination etched across his weathered face. The bailiff's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. Sir, you are not authorized to be in this courtroom during active proceedings. His voice carried the authority of years spent maintaining order in these hallowed halls of justice. The man stepped forward, his work boots echoing against the marble floor with each deliberate step. I said I will defend her, he repeated, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. The confidence in his tone was unmistakable, yet it carried an undertone of something deeper, something that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Laughter began to bubble up from various corners of the courtroom, a cruel symphony of disbelief and mockery. Who the hell is that guy? Someone whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. Probably got lost looking for the boiler room. Another voice chimed in, followed by more snickering. But Judge Harrison Matthews, a silver-haired veteran of the bench whose sharp gray eyes had seen every conceivable courtroom drama over his 30-year career, was not laughing. He peered over his wire-rimmed glasses with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. State your name for the record. Michael Weber, Your Honor. The man's voice never wavered, despite the hundreds of eyes boring into him from every direction. He stood with the posture of someone accustomed to being underestimated, yet unbroken by it. Judge Matthews leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mr. Weber, do you have legal representation for the defendant, Ms. Alexandra Sterling? Michael's gaze swept across the courtroom until it landed on the defendant's table, where Alexandra Sterling sat in isolated splendor. The woman who had graced the covers of every major business magazine, whose technological innovations had revolutionized entire industries, whose name was synonymous with brilliance and ruthless efficiency, sat completely alone. The chair beside her where her high-powered legal team should have been positioned remained conspicuously empty, a glaring testament to how quickly lies could vanish when the storm clouds gathered. Alexandra turned slowly to see who had dared to speak on her behalf, her movements controlled and elegant even in her moment of apparent abandonment. Her ice-blue eyes, which had once commanded boardrooms filled with some of the most powerful people in the world, now carried a mixture of fury and something that might have been desperation. When her gaze fell upon Michael, her perfectly composed mask cracked for just an instant. You, she breathed, the word barely audible even in the sudden hush that had fallen over the courtroom. Her eyes flicked to his tool belt, taking in the worn leather and the collection of equipment that marked him as part of the invisible workforce that kept her world functioning. You're the maintenance supervisor. Yes, ma'am, Michael replied with the same steady tone he might use when explaining a faulty heating system. I am, but I also know what they're trying to do to you here today. Alexandra's face twitched, a barely perceptible reaction that spoke volumes about the emotional armor she had spent years perfecting. She didn't laugh, but others in the courtroom were less restrained. A man in an expensive suit near the prosecution table leaned toward his colleague, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. Well, this should be over quickly. Judge Matthews raised his hand, instantly silencing the courtroom with the authority that came from 3 decades of commanding respect in this very chamber. Mr. Weber, he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity, are you licensed to practice law in this jurisdiction? No, sir, I am not, Michael admitted without hesitation, his honesty cutting through the courtroom's tension like a blade. I completed 2 years at the university law program before life circumstances required me to step away. But I've spent the last 15 years studying case law in my spare time, in this particular case. He reached into his coverall pocket and withdrew a thick folder, its pages marked with colored tabs and annotations that spoke of countless hours of meticulous preparation. I've analyzed every precedent, every filing, every piece of evidence that's been submitted. The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the kind that only comes when something unexpected and potentially significant is unfolding before everyone's eyes. Even the court reporter paused in her typing, her fingers hovering above the keys as if she too was trying to process what she was witnessing. The lead prosecutor, Harrison Kane, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in corporate fraud cases had earned him both fear and respect throughout the legal community, rose slowly from his seat. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, the expression of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Weber's enthusiasm, this is a federal securities fraud trial. Allowing a maintenance worker to represent a defendant facing charges that could result in decades of imprisonment is not only unprecedented, it borders on the absurd. But before Judge Matthews could respond, Alexandra's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. He's not representing me. Her words were delivered with the precision of a surgical strike, each syllable carefully measured and delivered with the kind of authority that had once commanded billion-dollar deals. He's speaking out of turn, and he has no authority to do so. Michael didn't flinch at her dismissal. Instead, he turned to face her directly, his brown eyes meeting her blue ones with unwavering intensity. You're absolutely right, Miss Sterling. I'm not your attorney, and I have no legal standing here. But you don't have anyone else in your corner right now, and this court needs to hear the truth before it makes a decision that could destroy an innocent woman's life. If you want me to stop talking, just say the word, and I'll walk out of here right now. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Alexandra stared at him. The woman who had built a technological empire from nothing, who had faced down hostile takeovers and navigated the treacherous waters of corporate politics with the skill of a master chess player, found herself studying the face of a man who spent his days fixing broken things and maintaining the infrastructure that kept her world running smoothly. Something flickered across her features, not fear, not gratitude, but something far more complex. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe recognition of something she had thought lost forever, someone willing to stand beside her when everyone else had fled. She didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched on, broken only by the steady tick of the courtroom clock and the soft rustle of papers as spectators shifted in their seats. Finally, she lifted her chin in the gesture that had become her trademark in boardroom negotiations, a signal that she was about to make a decision that would change everything. Judge Matthews cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a gavel strike. Under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 44, in cases where a defendant finds themselves without legal counsel through circumstances beyond their control, the court may allow a qualified individual to speak on behalf of the defendant during preliminary proceedings, provided the defendant does not object and the individual demonstrates sufficient knowledge of the relevant legal principles. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. Ms. Sterling, given the unexpected absence of your legal team and the complexity of the charges you're facing, do you object to Mr. Weber addressing the court on your behalf for the purposes of this hearing only? Alexandra glanced once more at the empty chair beside her, then at the folder in Michael's hands, and finally back at the judge. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would either save her or seal her fate. Let him speak, Your Honor. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted from mockery to intense curiosity as Michael Weber approached the defendant's table with the measured steps of a man who knew exactly what he was walking into. He set his folder down carefully, removed his work gloves with deliberate precision, and looked out at the sea of faces: reporters, legal professionals, corporate executives, and curious spectators who had come to witness what many expected to be the downfall of one of the most powerful women in business. But Michael had faced hostile audiences before. Every time he'd had to explain to a room full of executives why their building's systems had failed, every parent-teacher conference where he'd had to advocate for his daughter while other parents whispered about the maintenance man's kid, every moment when society had reminded him that his blue collar meant he was supposed to be invisible and silent. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the courtroom. On March 15th of this year, Sterling Technologies was accused of falsifying revenue projections in their quarterly filing to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The prosecution's case rests primarily on a digital signature that allegedly originated from Ms. Sterling's executive computer system. He opened his folder and withdrew a document marked with red ink annotations. But when I examined the metadata embedded in the digital filing information that most people never think to look at, I discovered something interesting. The signature that supposedly came from Ms. Sterling's office was actually generated from an IP address registered to a server farm located 3,000 miles away. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several reporters leaned forward in their seats, suddenly realizing that this might be more than just an amusing sideshow. Michael continued, his confidence growing with each word. Furthermore, the document formatting shows clear inconsistencies with every other filing that Sterling Technologies has ever submitted. The font spacing, the paragraph structure, even the legal language patterns, they all point to a document that was created by someone unfamiliar with the company's standard procedures. Harrison Kane, the prosecutor, rose to his feet with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to dominating courtrooms. Your Honor, even if Mr. Weber has managed to identify some technical inconsistencies, his analysis hardly constitutes admissible evidence. He lacks the credentials to serve as an expert witness, and his conclusions are based on speculation rather than forensic analysis. It's not speculation, Michael interrupted, his voice cutting through Kane's objection with surprising authority. It's data. Raw, verifiable data that anyone with basic computer forensics knowledge can confirm. He reached into his folder and withdrew another document. Here's a certified copy of the original quarterly filing, submitted to the SEC database 6 weeks before the allegedly revised version appeared. The original filing shows no irregularities, no inflated projections, and no attempts to mislead investors. Judge Matthews accepted the document from the court clerk and studied it carefully, his experienced eyes scanning the technical details with the focus of someone who had learned to spot deception in all its forms. Mr. Weber, what is your relationship to the defendant? Michael's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized everything he'd said so far. I maintain the building where she works, Your Honor. I've been responsible for the electrical systems, heating and cooling, security infrastructure, and general maintenance of Sterling Technologies headquarters for the past 4 years. The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy. This was the kind of detail that would make headlines, the maintenance man who stepped up to defend the CEO when her own lawyers abandoned her. Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, processing the unusual circumstances unfolding before him. This is highly irregular, but the evidence you've presented appears to have merit. I'm calling a recess until tomorrow morning to allow the prosecution time to review your documentation and for the court to verify the technical claims you've made. As he raised his gavel, the courtroom began to stir with anticipation. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. The sound of the gavel echoed through the chamber like a starting pistol, and immediately the room erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, cell phones already pressed to their ears as they called in what would undoubtedly become the lead story on every business news program. Legal experts huddled in corners, debating the precedent and implications of what they had just witnessed. But Alexandra Sterling remained seated, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she watched Michael collect his papers with the same methodical precision he probably brought to every task in his life. As the crowd thinned, she stood and walked around the table until she was standing just a few feet from him. I don't understand what you're doing, she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that sounded like the calm before a thunderstorm. But if you embarrass me in that courtroom tomorrow, if this turns out to be some misguided attempt at heroism, that backfires. It won't, Michael said simply, meeting her gaze without flinching. Because I'm not here to be a hero, Miss Sterling. I'm here because someone needs to tell the truth, and right now, I'm the only one in this building who seems willing to do it. Alexandra studied his face, searching for something: doubt, uncertainty, hidden motives, anything that might explain why a man she barely knew would risk everything to defend her. You realize that if you're wrong about this, if your evidence doesn't hold up under scrutiny, you'll be finished. No one will ever hire you again. You'll be a laughingstock. Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of what she was saying. I've been finished before, Miss Sterling. It's not as scary as people think. And sometimes, being willing to lose everything is the only way to save what really matters. He gathered his folder and turned to leave, but paused when she called his name. Weber. Yes, ma'am. Tomorrow, when you walk back into that courtroom, what makes you so certain you're right about this? Michael looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the powerful CEO or the embattled defendant, but simply a woman who had been backed into a corner by forces she couldn't control. Because I've spent 4 years watching you work, Miss Sterling. I've seen how you treat people when you think no one is looking. I've observed your attention to detail, your integrity, your commitment to doing things the right way even when it would be easier to cut corners. The woman I've watched all this time isn't capable of the kind of fraud they're accusing you of." With that, he walked away, leaving Alexandra standing alone in the emptying courtroom, for the first time in years genuinely uncertain about what the next day would bring. The night air was crisp as Michael Weber sat on the courthouse steps, his folder open on his lap like a sacred text. The city lights stretched out before him, a constellation of ambition and dreams that never seemed to sleep. He'd sent his daughter Sophie to stay with his sister for a few days, not wanting her to be caught in the media storm that was sure to follow. At 14, she was old enough to understand that her father was taking a stand for something important, but still young enough to be protected from the potential consequences. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Dad, I saw you on the news. You look like a superhero without a cape." Despite everything weighing on his mind, Michael smiled. His daughter had inherited her mother's ability to find light in the darkest moments. "Mr. Weber." The voice came from behind him, cultured and precise. He turned to see Alexandra Sterling approaching, no longer the composed executive from the courtroom, but a woman who looked as though she hadn't slept in days. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, the first time he'd ever seen her in anything other than perfectly tailored business attire. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, closing his folder. "Shouldn't you be meeting with whatever lawyers you can find to replace the ones who disappeared?" Alexandra sat down beside him, maintaining a careful distance but close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume mixed with what might have been exhaustion. "I tried. Apparently, defending me has become somewhat radioactive in legal circles. Seems like everyone received the same memo about keeping their distance." Michael studied her profile in the dim light from the courthouse entrance. "That doesn't surprise you, does it?" "No," she admitted, her voice carrying a weariness that spoke of battles fought on multiple fronts. "I've been in this business long enough to know that when the sharks smell blood in the water, even your oldest allies suddenly develop amnesia about your phone number." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people from vastly different worlds who had somehow found themselves on the same side of an impossible fight. Finally, Alexandra spoke again, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than he'd ever heard it. "You mentioned earlier that you've been watching me for 4 years. What exactly have you seen?" Michael considered the question carefully. "I've seen you stay in the office until midnight, not because you had to, but because you wanted to personally review every detail of a product launch that would create jobs for 300 people. I've seen you take phone calls at 6 in the morning from engineers in other time zones because their input mattered to you, even when it meant rewriting months of work." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've also seen you in the break room at 3 a.m., making coffee for the overnight security team and asking about their families. I've watched you personally deliver thank you notes to the cleaning staff during the holidays. Those aren't the actions of someone who would commit fraud for personal gain." Alexandra was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, I found a document in my office that I'd never seen before. It was tucked into a folder of routine contracts, but something about it felt wrong. The language was different, the formatting was off, and it contained financial projections that I knew weren't accurate. Michael turned to face her fully. "What did you do with it?" "I asked my assistant, David Kruger, to investigate where it had come from. He was the only person other than myself who had access to my digital signature protocols." Her voice hardened slightly. 2 days later, he submitted his resignation. No explanation, no notice period, just gone. "And you think he's connected to this?" Alexandra nodded slowly. "David had been with me for 6 years. He knew every aspect of my business operations, had access to all my passwords and security codes. If someone wanted to frame me for financial fraud, he would have been the perfect inside man." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Did you report this to anyone?" "Who would I report it to? The board of directors who are probably looking for any excuse to force me out? The SEC investigators who are already convinced I'm guilty? The lawyers who won't return my phone calls?" She laughed bitterly. "I built my entire career on the principle that if you're smart enough and work hard enough, you can overcome any obstacle. But this feels like fighting shadows." Michael opened his folder and pulled out a photocopy of the document he'd found weeks ago. Is this the document you're talking about? Alexandra's eyes widened as she recognized the papers. Where did you get this? I found it in the building's central shredding system 3 weeks ago. The industrial shredder had jammed, and when I cleared the blockage, this was caught in the mechanism. Only about half of it had been destroyed. He pointed to the partially shredded edges. I kept it because something about the formatting looked wrong. It didn't match the style of other Sterling Technologies documents I'd seen. You've been carrying around evidence for 3 weeks? I didn't know it was evidence until yesterday, when I started researching the charges against you. Michael's voice carried a note of frustration. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how wrong until I saw what they were accusing you of. Alexandra stared at the document, her mind racing through the implications. This proves that someone tried to destroy evidence. If we can trace the digital fingerprints, find out who created this document and when. Already working on it, Michael said. I have a friend who works in computer forensics. He's agreed to analyze the metadata off the books, see what he can find. For the first time since this nightmare began, Alexandra felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Why are you doing this, Michael? Really, you could lose everything: your job, your reputation, your future. What's worth that kind of risk? Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that were barely visible against the city's glow. When my wife died 5 years ago, I was so consumed by grief that I almost gave up on everything. The only thing that kept me going was Sophie. She needed her father to show her that good people don't just roll over when life gets hard. He met Alexandra's eyes. Yesterday, when I saw you sitting in that courtroom alone, abandoned by everyone who should have been protecting you, I realized that this was one of those moments when you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. I want my daughter to grow up in a world where people stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Alexandra felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she'd built so carefully over the years suddenly developing fissures. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't need to thank me, Michael replied. Just promise me that when this is over, you'll remember what it felt like to have someone believe in you when everyone else had given up. As they sat together on the courthouse steps, both of them felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down like an approaching storm. But for the first time in weeks, neither of them felt like they were facing it alone. The next morning arrived gray and uncertain, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like a metaphor made manifest. Michael Weber stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie that felt foreign around his neck. He'd purchased the navy blue suit the night before his first new suit in over a decade because he knew that today, appearances would matter almost as much as evidence. His phone buzzed with a text from his forensics contact. You need to see this. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th before court. 30 minutes later, Michael sat across from Tommy Martinez, a soft-spoken computer expert whose unassuming appearance belied his reputation as one of the most skilled digital investigators in the private sector. Tommy's laptop was open between them, displaying screens full of code and metadata that looked like hieroglyphics to most people, but told a clear story to those who knew how to read it. Your instincts were right, Tommy said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. This document was created remotely, definitely not from Sterling Technologies' internal systems. But it gets more interesting. The digital signature was applied using a cloned authentication key. Michael leaned forward, meaning someone had access to Alexandra Sterling's actual digital credentials, but they used them from an external location to make it look like she was trying to hide something. Tommy scrolled through several screens of data. The timestamp shows the document was created at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, but Sterling's keycard logs show she wasn't even in the building that night. Can you trace where it actually came from? Tommy nodded, pulling up another screen. The IP address traces back to a virtual private network service, but I was able to penetrate that layer. The actual origin point is a small office building about 20 miles outside the city. Want to guess who leases space in that building? Michael's stomach tightened. David Kruger? Not directly, but a consulting firm called Pacific Solutions LLC rents a suite there, and according to their business registration, David Kruger is listed as their chief technology officer. Tommy closed the laptop with a decisive snap. This wasn't some sophisticated international conspiracy. It was an inside job executed by someone who got greedy and sloppy. Michael checked his watch. Court would resume in 2 hours, which gave him just enough time to drive out to the office building and see what else he could discover. Tommy, I need you to document everything you just showed me in a formal report. Can you have that ready by this afternoon? Already working on it. And Michael? Tommy's expression was serious. Be careful. If Kruger was willing to frame his boss for federal crimes, he won't hesitate to eliminate a maintenance worker who's getting too close to the truth. The drive to Pacific Solutions LLC took Michael through a series of industrial parks and office complexes that looked like they'd been built quickly and cheaply to house the kind of businesses that preferred to operate in the shadows. The address led him to a nondescript three-story building with tinted windows and minimal signage. The lobby was empty except for a bored-looking security guard who barely glanced up from his newspaper when Michael entered. The building directory showed Pacific Solutions LLC in Suite 217, but when Michael took the elevator to the second floor, he found the office door locked with no signs of recent activity. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind him, and Michael turned to see a woman in her 50s emerging from the neighboring office with a coffee cup in her hand. "I was looking for Pacific Solutions," Michael said, trying to sound casual. "I had a meeting scheduled with David Kruger." The woman's expression shifted to something that might have been concern. "Oh, honey, I think you might be out of luck. That office has been empty for about 2 weeks now. The guy who rented it, nice enough fellow, though he kept odd hours, cleared out all his equipment one night and never came back." "Did he say where he was going?" "No, but I remember thinking it was strange. He'd been there for almost 6 months, had all this expensive computer equipment delivered, and then suddenly he's gone without even cleaning out his desk." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think he might have been running some kind of online business that wasn't entirely legitimate, if you know what I mean." Michael thanked her and returned to his car, his mind racing through the implications. David Kruger had spent months planning this fraud, setting up a false office and building the technical infrastructure needed to frame Alexandra. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy her reputation and steal her company. But why? What did Kruger have to gain from bringing down one of the most successful tech companies in the country? And more importantly, was he working alone, or was there someone else pulling the strings? As Michael drove back toward the courthouse, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Mr. Weber?" The voice was nervous, young, and clearly scared. "This is Sarah Chun. I used to work with David Kruger at Sterling Technologies." Michael pulled over to the side of the road. "What can I do for you, Sarah? I saw you on the news last night, and I think there are some things you need to know about David. Things that might help Miss Sterling." She paused, as if gathering courage. "Can we meet somewhere private? I'm afraid that if David finds out I'm talking to you, I might be in danger." Michael glanced at his watch. He still had an hour before court resumed, just enough time for one more crucial conversation that might provide the final piece of the puzzle he'd been assembling. "Where do you want to meet?" As he drove toward the meeting location, Michael felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the same satisfaction he experienced when diagnosing a complex mechanical problem. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher than a broken heating system or a malfunctioning elevator. This time, he was fighting to save not just Alexandra Sterling's reputation, but the fundamental principle that truth and justice could still prevail in a world that often seemed rigged in favor of those with the most money and the fewest scruples. The small diner where Michael met Sarah Chun was the kind of place that existed on the margins of the business district, frequented by shift workers, late-night truckers, and people who needed to have conversations they didn't want to be overheard. Sarah sat in a corner booth, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold long ago. She was young, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that suggested she'd gone into technology because she believed it could make the world a better place. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as Michael slid into the booth across from her. "I wasn't sure if I should get involved, but after watching the news coverage, I realized I might be the only person who can explain what really happened." Michael ordered coffee from the waitress and gave Sarah his full attention. "Tell me about David Kruger." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I was hired 6 months ago as a junior systems analyst. David was my supervisor, and at first, I thought he was brilliant. He knew every aspect of Sterling Technologies' computer systems, had access to everything, and he seemed completely devoted to Ms. Sterling." "What changed your mind?" "About 3 months ago, I started noticing that David was working a lot of late nights and weekends. but not on any projects that were officially on the schedule. When I asked him about it, he said he was working on special assignments directly from Ms. Sterling, but something about his manner made me suspicious. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. I started keeping copies of his work logs, his system access records, anything that seemed unusual. I'm not proud of spying on my supervisor, but my instincts were telling me that something wasn't right. Michael accepted the flash drive. What did you find? David was using his administrative access to copy sensitive financial documents, client contracts, and proprietary algorithms. But he wasn't just copying them, he was modifying them, creating alternate versions that showed the company in a negative light. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. I think he was building a case against Ms. Sterling, manufacturing evidence to make it look like she was engaged in fraudulent activities. Did you confront him about this? Sarah shook her head. I was afraid. David had become increasingly paranoid and aggressive. He started coming to work at strange hours, avoiding other employees, and I caught him several times going through Ms. Sterling's office when she wasn't there. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. But there's something else. David wasn't working alone. Michael felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? He had regular phone calls with someone, always late at night when he thought no one else was around. I could never hear the full conversations, but I caught fragments. They were discussing timelines, talking about the acquisition, planning something they called Phase 2. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear. Mr. Weber, I think David was working with someone who wanted to take over Sterling Technologies. The fraud charges, the missing lawyers, the board members suddenly turning against Ms. Sterling, it's all connected. Michael stared at the flash drive in his hand, realizing that what he'd thought was a simple case of employee fraud was actually something much larger and more dangerous. Sarah, have you told anyone else about this? No. I quit my job 2 weeks ago because I was afraid of what might happen if David discovered what I knew. I've been hiding ever since, trying to decide what to do. She leaned forward urgently. But when I saw you standing up for Ms. Sterling in that courtroom, I realized that maybe there was still someone willing to fight for the truth. Michael checked his watch. Court would resume in 20 minutes. Barely enough time to get back to the courthouse, let alone process the bombshell Sarah had just dropped. I need you to do something for me. I need you to come to the courthouse and tell the judge exactly what you just told me. Sarah's face went pale. I can't. If David sees me there, if whoever he's working with realizes I know about their plan, you'll be under the court's protection. And if we don't expose this conspiracy today, Alexandra Sterling is going to be convicted of crimes she didn't commit, and the real criminals will get away with destroying one of the most innovative companies in the country. For a long moment, Sarah sat in silence, wrestling with a decision that could determine not only her own future, but the outcome of a case that had captured national attention. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll do it. But I want police protection, and I want immunity from prosecution for any inadvertent involvement in David's activities. I'll make sure that happens, Michael promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how he would keep that promise. As they prepared to leave the diner, he realized that he was about to walk into a courtroom and accuse unknown conspirators of orchestrating a sophisticated frame job without knowing who those conspirators were or how far they were willing to go to protect their interests. But as they drove back toward the courthouse, Michael thought about Alexandra Sterling sitting alone in that courtroom and about his daughter Sophie believing that her father was fighting for something important. Sometimes, he reflected, you had to take a leap of faith and trust that the truth would provide its own protection. The only question now was whether that faith would be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. The courthouse was buzzing with anticipation as Michael and Sarah entered through the main doors. Word had spread that the maintenance worker who had disrupted yesterday's proceedings had uncovered new evidence, and reporters, legal experts, and curious spectators had packed the gallery to capacity. Michael could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes following his movement as he approached the defendant's table where Alexandra Sterling sat waiting. She looked up as he approached, and he could see the mixture of hope and desperation in her expression. Please tell me you have good news, she said quietly. Better than good news, Michael replied, setting his folder on the table and indicating Sarah, who stood nervously behind him. I have the truth, and I have a witness who can prove that this entire case is built on manufactured evidence. Judge Matthews called the court to order, and the sudden silence that fell over the packed courtroom was electric with tension. Harrison Kane, the prosecutor, looked confident and relaxed, clearly expecting to demolish whatever amateur evidence the maintenance worker had managed to cobble together. "Your Honor," Michael began, standing at the defense table with the same steady confidence he'd displayed the day before. "I'd like to call Sarah Chun to testify about her direct knowledge of systematic evidence manipulation conducted by David Kruger, Ms. Sterling's former assistant." Kane shot to his feet immediately. "Objection. This witness hasn't been properly disclosed, and Mr. Weber lacks the authority to call witnesses in a federal proceeding." Judge Matthews looked at Sarah, then at Michael, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Chun, are you here voluntarily to provide testimony relevant to this case?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Yes, Your Honor. I have information about criminal activities that directly relate to the charges against Ms. Sterling. I'll allow preliminary testimony," Judge Matthews ruled. "But Mr. Weber, this is highly irregular, and if this witness doesn't provide substantive evidence, I'll hold you in contempt." Sarah took the witness stand with trembling hands, but her voice grew stronger as she began to speak. "6 months ago, I was hired as a systems analyst at Sterling Technologies under the supervision of David Kruger. What I witnessed during my employment, there was a systematic campaign to manufacture evidence against Ms. Sterling." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Matthews had to use his gavel to restore order. Sarah continued, describing in detail how she had observed Kruger working late nights to modify financial documents, create false audit trails, and establish the technical infrastructure needed to make fraudulent activities appear to originate from Alexandra's computer systems. "Do you have any evidence to support these claims?" Michael asked. Sarah held up the flash drive. "I documented everything. System access logs, modified file timestamps, records of unauthorized network connections, and audio recordings of phone conversations where Mr. Kruger discussed the timeline for the acquisition with unknown conspirators." Harrison Kane's confident demeanor had evaporated completely. He stood again, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to deflect attention from Mr. Kane," Judge Matthews interrupted. "I suggest you allow the witness to complete her testimony before raising objections." Sarah's testimony continued for another 30 minutes, each revelation more damaging than the last. She described how Kruger had used his administrative access to plant false evidence in company servers, how he had created dummy email accounts to generate fake correspondence, and how he had systematically copied and modified proprietary algorithms to make it appear that Sterling Technologies was stealing intellectual property from competitors. But the most explosive revelation came when Sarah played an audio recording she had secretly made of one of Kruger's late-night phone conversations. Phase 2 is ready for implementation. Kruger's voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. "The fraud charges will stick, the board will panic, and Sterling will be forced to accept our acquisition offer within the week. The beauty of this plan is that even if she's eventually exonerated, the damage to her reputation will be irreversible." The voice on the other end was equally chilling. "Excellent. Our investors are ready to move forward as soon as Sterling Technologies' stock price crashes. By the time this is over, we'll own her company for pennies on the dollar, and she'll be lucky if she can get a job managing a coffee shop." The courtroom was dead silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a case of employee fraud, it was corporate espionage and market manipulation on a massive scale. Michael stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have forensic evidence that corroborates Ms. Chin's testimony." He handed the court clerk a thick folder. Computer analysis conducted by an independent expert confirms that the supposedly fraudulent documents were created remotely using cloned authentication credentials, and that the IP address is traced back to an office building leased by a shell company connected to David Kruger. Alexandra Sterling sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full scope of the conspiracy that had been orchestrated against her. The woman who had built her career on her ability to anticipate and counter competitive threats had been blindsided by an attack that came from within her own organization. Judge Matthews reviewed the evidence for several minutes before looking up at Harrison Kane. "Mr. Kane, does the prosecution have any response to this testimony?" Kane looked like a man who had just watched his entire case collapse in real time. "Your Honor, we..." The prosecution will need time to evaluate this new information and determine whether the charges against Ms. Sterling should be reconsidered. I'll give you until tomorrow morning, Judge Matthews said. But based on what I've heard today, I'm inclined to dismiss all charges against Ms. Sterling and refer this matter to the FBI for investigation of potential corporate conspiracy and securities manipulation. As the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, their phones already buzzing with the story that would dominate headlines for weeks. Legal experts huddled in animated discussions about the precedent and implications of what had just unfolded. But in the center of it all, Alexandra Sterling stood slowly and turned to face Michael Weber, the maintenance worker who had risked everything to expose the truth. For the first time in months, her carefully constructed emotional armor had completely cracked, and tears were streaming down her face. "How do I thank you for this?" she whispered. Michael's answer was simple and direct. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to remember that sometimes the people who see everything are the ones nobody notices." 3 weeks later, the Sterling Technologies building hummed with a different kind of energy. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the company had been exposed in spectacular fashion, leading to federal indictments against David Kruger and 3 executives from rival corporations who had orchestrated the acquisition scheme. The story had become a media sensation, spawning documentaries, podcast series, and countless articles about corporate espionage in the digital age. But for Michael Weber, the most meaningful change was much simpler. He no longer felt invisible. As he walked through the building's lobby, employees who had previously looked through him now nodded respectfully, offered genuine smiles, and sometimes stopped to thank him for what he had done. The security guards called him by name, the executive assistants asked about his daughter, and the janitorial staff treated him like a hero who had proven that blue-collar workers could change the world. Alexandra Sterling had offered him a position as director of corporate security, complete with a 6-figure salary and an office on the executive floor. But after careful consideration, Michael had declined. He loved the hands-on work of maintaining complex systems, the satisfaction of solving mechanical problems, and the peaceful solitude that came with working while others slept. What he had accepted was a consulting role that allowed him to split his time between his maintenance duties and helping to rebuild Sterling Technologies' security infrastructure. It was the perfect compromise, meaningful work that utilized his unique skills while keeping him grounded in the practical, honest labor that had shaped his character. On this particular evening, as Michael finished his rounds and prepared to head home to Sophie, he found Alexandra waiting for him in the lobby. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger and more approachable than the power suits and executive armor had ever allowed. "I wanted to catch you before you left," she said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the parking garage. "The board meeting went well today. The investigators have recovered most of the stolen algorithms, and our stock price is back to pre-conspiracy levels." Michael nodded, genuinely pleased by the news. "I'm glad things are getting back to normal for you." "Normal?" Alexandra repeated the word as if tasting something unfamiliar. "I'm not sure I want things to go back to the way they were before." The old normal was what allowed someone like David to get so close that he could nearly destroy everything I'd built. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, their footsteps echoing in the nearly empty garage. Finally, Alexandra spoke again, her voice softer and more vulnerable than Michael had ever heard it. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in the courtroom about how the people who see everything are the ones nobody notices. I realized that I'd become so focused on staying ahead of my competitors, on protecting myself from external threats, that I'd stopped paying attention to the people right in front of me." Michael paused beside his truck, an aging vehicle that looked distinctly out of place among the luxury cars that filled the executive parking section. It's easy to miss things when you're moving too fast. Sometimes slowing down is the only way to see clearly. Alexandra leaned against the truck's tailgate, a gesture that would have been unthinkable for the CEO who had ruled from the top floor just a month ago. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always am. Do you think less of me for not seeing what David was doing? For being so focused on external threats that I missed the danger coming from within my own organization?" Michael considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would matter more than simple reassurance. "I think you're human," he said finally. "I think you built something extraordinary, and extraordinary things attract people who want to tear them down. David Kruger didn't succeed because you were weak or naive. He succeeded because he was willing to betray someone who trusted him. But if I had been more observant, more connected to my employees, you would have been a different person, Michael interrupted gently. Maybe a better manager, but maybe not the innovator who created technologies that changed entire industries. We all have blind spots, Alexandra. The important thing is what we do once we realize they exist. She looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, something that spoke of a connection forged in the fires of shared adversity. I don't know what this is, she said quietly, gesturing between them. I don't know what it means or where it leads, but I know that I don't want it to end. Michael felt his heart rate increase, understanding that they had arrived at a moment that would define everything that came next. I don't want it to end either, he admitted. But I also don't want you to feel obligated to me because of what happened in that courtroom. Obligation? Alexandra laughed, but it was a sound filled with genuine warmth rather than bitterness. Michael, what I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation. It's about recognizing someone whose values align with my own, someone who sees the world clearly and isn't afraid to act on what he sees. They moved closer together, not quite touching, but close enough that Michael could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume mixed with something that might have been hope. I've spent most of my adult life believing that vulnerability was weakness, Alexandra continued. But these last few weeks, watching you risk everything for something you believed in, has taught me that maybe vulnerability is actually a form of strength, the strength to care about something more than you care about protecting yourself. Michael reached out and gently took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of puzzle pieces finding their proper places. Sophie asked me last night if I thought you were going to become part of our family, he said with a smile. I told her that some things can't be rushed, but that the best things in life are usually worth waiting for. And what did she say to that? She said that if you're patient enough to let a maintenance worker save your company, you're probably patient enough to let a 14-year-old teach you how to play chess. Alexandra laughed, the sound echoing through the parking garage like music. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. As they stood together in the quiet garage, surrounded by the mundane reality of concrete and fluorescent lights, both of them understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something precious and rare, a love story built not on fairy tale romance, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the hard-won trust that comes from facing adversity together. The maintenance worker and the CEO, two people from different worlds who had discovered that the most important differences between people weren't about money or status or education, but about character and courage and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it costs everything. And in that moment, under the harsh lights of a parking garage in a building where one of them fixed things and the other built them, they both knew they had found something worth fighting for. The community center was buzzing with excitement as families gathered for the annual science fair, an event that had grown considerably in scope and prestige since Sterling Technologies had become its primary sponsor. Children from across the city displayed projects ranging from simple volcano demonstrations to sophisticated robotics experiments, their faces glowing with the pride that comes from creating something with their own hands and minds. Sophie Weber stood beside her display with the confidence of someone who had inherited both her father's practical intelligence and her late mother's gift for clear communication. Her project, a working model of a building's automated systems that demonstrated how technology could improve energy efficiency and safety, had drawn a steady stream of interested visitors throughout the day. The key insight, she explained to a group of impressed adults, is that complex systems work best when all the components communicate effectively with each other. It's not enough for each part to function well individually, they have to be integrated in a way that serves the whole. Michael stood nearby, watching his daughter with the mixture of pride and amazement that had become familiar over the past few months. Sophie had blossomed in ways that went far beyond her academic achievements, gaining confidence and perspective from watching her father prove that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. She's remarkable, Alexandra said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee from the refreshment table. She had traded her executive suits for jeans and a Sterling Technologies polo shirt, looking more relaxed and approachable than Michael had ever seen her during their early encounters. She gets that from her mother, Michael replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. But the stubbornness and the tendency to see things others miss, that's probably from me. Those aren't character flaws, Alexandra said with a smile. Those are superpowers. They watched as Sophie demonstrated her project for the third time in an hour, patiently answering questions from younger children who were trying to understand how sensors and automated systems could work together to create smarter buildings. Her natural teaching ability and genuine enthusiasm for sharing knowledge reminded Michael of why he had fallen in love with education before life had taken him in a different direction. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," Alexandra said quietly, her voice carrying a note of careful consideration. "About the scholarship program for children of service workers." Michael turned to give her his full attention. Ever since the conspiracy trial had ended, Alexandra had been exploring ways to use Sterling Technologies' resources to address the systematic inequalities that allowed talented people like Michael to be overlooked and undervalued. The scholarship program was her most ambitious initiative, a comprehensive effort to identify and support brilliant children whose potential might otherwise go unrecognized because of their family's economic circumstances. The board approved the full funding, Alexandra continued. 50 scholarships per year, covering everything from tutoring and test preparation through graduate school. We're calling it the Hidden Potential Initiative. Michael felt a familiar tightness in his throat, the same emotion that had overwhelmed him in the courtroom when he realized that his actions might actually change things for the better. That's going to transform lives, Alexandra. Kids who never thought college was possible, families who've been working multiple jobs just to keep their heads above water. Kids like Sophie, Alexandra said simply. Though honestly, I don't think she's going to need our help getting into whatever school she chooses. They were interrupted by Sophie herself, who bounded over with the enthusiasm of someone whose project had just won first place in her age category. "Dad, did you see? I won." She held up a blue ribbon with the same pride that other children might display after hitting a home run or performing in a school play. "I saw," Michael said, pulling her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." "Ms. Sterling." Sophie turned to Alexandra with barely contained excitement. "Did you see my project? I used the principles from your building's automated systems as a starting point, but I added some modifications that could improve efficiency by another 12%. Alexandra knelt to Sophie's eye level, giving the girl the same focused attention she might offer to a board of directors. "I did see it, and I was incredibly impressed. Have you considered studying engineering in college?" "Maybe," Sophie said thoughtfully. "But I'm also interested in law, especially after watching Dad prove that one person with the right evidence can change everything." She paused, looking between the two adults with the perceptive intelligence that had become her trademark. "Though I suppose the most important thing is finding work that lets you help people, regardless of what you call it." Michael and Alexandra exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their shared recognition of the wisdom that sometimes came from unexpected sources. Sophie had articulated something that both of them had learned over the past few months, that meaningful work wasn't defined by titles or salaries, but by the impact it had on other people's lives. As the science fair began to wind down and families started packing up their displays, the three of them walked together toward the parking lot. Sophie chattered excitedly about the other projects she had seen, the friends she had made, and the ideas she was already developing for next year's competition. "Are you coming to dinner tonight?" Sophie asked Alexandra as they reached Michael's truck. It had become a weekly tradition, these casual Sunday dinners that bore no resemblance to the formal business meals that had once defined Alexandra's social calendar. "Wouldn't miss it," Alexandra replied. "Though I should warn you that I bought ingredients for that pasta recipe I found online, and there's no guarantee it will be edible." Sophie giggled. "Dad can help you with the cooking. He's actually really good at it, even though he pretends he's not." As they separated to their respective vehicles, Michael felt the familiar sense of gratitude that had become a constant presence in his life. 6 months ago, he had been a widowed maintenance worker whose primary concern was providing for his daughter and staying invisible in a world that rarely noticed people like him. Now he was part of a family that had formed not through traditional romance or conventional expectations, but through shared values and mutual respect. The conspiracy trial had made him briefly famous, But the real transformation in his life had nothing to do with media attention or public recognition. It was about discovering that love could grow in the most unlikely places, that trust could be earned through actions rather than words, and that sometimes the most important changes in the world began with one person refusing to look away when everyone else found it convenient to remain blind. As he drove home with Sophie chattering beside him about her plans for next year's science fair, Michael reflected on the truth that had guided him through the darkest moments of the past few months. That dignity wasn't something that could be granted or taken away by external circumstances, but something that came from within, from the choice to stand up for what was right even when it seemed impossible. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice led not just to justice, but to love, family, and the kind of happiness that could only be earned through the willingness to risk everything for something larger than yourself. The maintenance worker who had shaken the boardroom had discovered that the most important repairs weren't made to buildings or machines, but to the broken places in human hearts and the damaged connections between people who had forgotten how to see each other clearly. And in the end, those were the only repairs that really mattered.